One of my sayings is, I didn't want to teach my kid to respect boundaries. I wanted to teach my kid to want to respect boundaries. Hi, everybody. Vivek Patel here from Meaningful Ideas, talking about boundaries. And just a short thing about boundaries and kids. So when I talk about boundaries, or whenever I talk about limits, or whenever I talk about anything that's radically non-coercive, because that's me, I always get a lot of pushback, which makes sense. It's reasonable, because it still seems like we need some control, we need some hierarchy, we need some power. And I'm saying with our kids, when we're working with our kids, let's throw all that out. Let's work with them collaboratively. Let's work with them with horizontal power sharing so that we're not imposing our will on them and not trying to control them, but we guide them. So boundaries and limits are part of that. I am firmly against setting coercive, hierarchical, non-consensual boundaries and limits on kids. Now, the reason I mention coercive, hierarchical, non-consensual is because I think boundaries and limits are an important thing for us to explore with kids. I think that limits are something empowering for kids, and boundaries are something empowering for kids, not just kids, but adults too, to really understand that. Limits are limits that we place on ourselves to help us, sleep more and eat better and whatever, to be healthier in our lives, and boundaries so that we keep ourselves safe from harmful external influences. These things are really important to discover and to explore and to build capacity around, because so many adults don't have capacity around those things. So I'm all for those things. What I'm not for is imposing them on kids against their will, largely because that doesn't actually teach them the skill. In fact, it does the opposite. It makes them hate boundaries. It makes them hate limits, our own and other people's. When we impose boundaries on kids that they don't like, when we impose limits on kids that they don't like, it doesn't inspire them to want to care for those things. One of my sayings is, I didn't want to teach my kid to respect boundaries. I wanted to teach my kid to want to respect boundaries. And that's the thing, right? Like, so often we make learning a drag. So first of all, I want to say that with limits and boundaries, I do think they're important in the parenting toolbox. I think they're important for empowering our kids with them, but... and I say but, but I want to do it non-coercively. I want to do it in a way that's inspiring, that's connecting, that's respectful of their humanity and their autonomy and their consent. So when we impose a limit on our kid, when we impose a boundary on our kid that they don't like and they don't accept, it's not going to make them care about that more. It's not going to make them care about the other people that they might be impacting. It's not going to make them care about themselves. And it's not going to make them want to learn and explore boundaries and limits. Now, the other side of limits and boundaries is that there is always a power differential in play when we're dealing with boundaries. So when parents are setting boundaries and limits on their kids, there's a big power differential there. We have all this power over kids. And when someone with more power imposes their will on someone with less power, it's a violent act. The only way that we can enforce a limit or boundary on our kids is with relational violence, emotional violence, physical violence, access to resources violence, or power. And so this is something that I'm firmly against because, again, when we become conscious parents, we want to relate to our power very consciously. I just put up a post a couple of days ago on systemic power, how adults have all this systemic power. Now, in adult relationships, it's the same. In adult relationships, we want to empower the people who are more marginalized to be able to set boundaries for themselves to keep themselves safe, to keep themselves healthy, to draw a circle of protection and what makes sense for them. We don't want people who go out in the world and can't establish boundaries. They can't keep themselves safe and they don't know their worth, right? Boundaries come from self-love. They come from an inherent understanding of our self-worth and not wanting to be treated badly. Now, in a situation where one person has more power than the other, more systemic power than the other, more societal power than the other, of some kind or the other, again, it could be racial, it could be gender, it could be sexual orientation, it can be financial, it can be, did I say racial already? And so many different things, ability, disability. So there's so many different areas of systemic power and oppression in our society. And it's important for us to understand that people who have more systemic power have to be very careful about using that power. People who are in marginalized identities, we want them to be empowered with their limits and boundaries. It's actually the same with kids, right? It's the same situation. Part of the reason I'm mentioning this is I put a post up recently about firm and kind, which is another gentle parenting saying that I just can't stand, and I'm going to do a video about it at some point. But firm and kind are opposites in many ways. Then most of the time, all of the time, when parent educators say firm and kind limits, what they mean is set an authoritative power over limit on your kids that they don't have a choice. And then when they're upset, you empathize, saying it's hard not to get what you want. And I always say you can't be the perpetrator and the empathizer at the same time. It's the same in adult relationships. You can't be the perpetrator and the empathizer at the same time. And so somebody on there said, well, what about, this thing about boundaries is dangerous because women need to be empowered to set boundaries. And if they are too concerned about trying to be kind when they're setting their boundaries or concerned about it, then they can't empower themselves. And I completely agree. Because it's the same situation, right? It's a situation of someone with a marginalized identity that has systemic power, that doesn't have the systemic power in the situation, needing to protect themselves against, the forces of systemic oppression. And it's the same with kids. So it's the power differential that really matters here. So I want to empower kids to set their boundaries so that they learn to set boundaries and they learn to respect the boundaries of others as well. This is really important. When we're dealing with adult relationships, it's different though, because in the parent-child relationship, the kid doesn't really have the power, the awareness to set and hold their boundaries. And we're, as parents, we can just override it so easily. In the world of adults, similar, an adult can walk away, but a lot of the time they can't because of systemic causes. Largely financial is what keeps people, especially women and people of marginalized genders, in abusive relationships. Largely financial oppression is one of the main reasons they can't. There's so many different things that play into it. It's not fair to say, oh, they should just be able to leave. So many people just say, oh, they should just leave. No, there's so many things at play here. So if we want to empower people, if we want to empower our kids, we want to really help them learn the power of setting boundaries. And so when we as parents use our power to set boundaries and limits on our kids, then of course that's problematic. It's teaching them the opposite of empowering them with it. So this is where I'm coming from with this. Now, of course, if a kid is going to hurt another kid or, run into the street, I always get run into the street or hit another kid or eat poison or touch a hot stove. For these things, of course, you want to stop them from doing that. But we can still do that in a way that's kind and non-shaming, not making a rule that you have to enforce with consequences, but it's a value that we explore together. So yes, keep your kids safe, keep the other kids safe, but let's do it without exerting our power, without wrongness, without shame and blame, so that the kids stay open to our guidance and we can learn about these things together. So it's a complex issue. I'll probably talk more and more about boundaries and limits as time goes on. I have a video on my YouTube channel called Enforcement Sucks, because it's the enforcement of limits and boundaries in the hierarchical relationship that's the problem, because you can't enforce without power. So that's it, everybody. I'm just going to leave it there. I know it's not a complete picture, but it's more than I can put in a couple of tweets, and I wanted to share a few of my thoughts. Peace out. Please follow me on all the social media at Meaningful Ideas, and also meaningfulideas.com. I have my free course, Guiding Without Controlling, which is like what this is all about, treating our kids as equals and still being their guide. And that's it. Peace out, everyone.